Good afternoon. My name is Tim Mayo, and I'm going to be reading with Sydney Lee, and this is all being recorded with the help of Michelle Singer from Kellogg-Hubbard Library, and I really want to thank her very much for setting this up. Um, I'll be reading, I think, exclusively from my new book, Notes to the Mental Hospital Timekeeper. And after I'm done reading, I think Sydney will read. Um, so, to tell you a little bit about myself, I work in a mental hospital, which is the reason for the book. I've worked in a mental hospital for about 10 years, and I have collected poems over this time and poems that I've done in the past year and a half, and decided to put out a book on on my experiences. Um, I work in different. Uh, I have different sort of hats that I wear when I work there. I substitute teach in the school, and then I also work on the inpatient and the outpatient units of the hospital. And some of this will come out in the poems. The I guess I'll just jump in, and my first poem is um, entitled Note to the Mental Hospital Timekeeper. Dear Bob, today I subbed at the hospital school, babysitting class after class, teaching the kids nothing, the ones who live across the street in the group homes the hospital runs. As you can see from the time clock ADP provides both you and me, it took the allotted 6.5 hours before the kids and I gathered up our cats, coats, and hats, calling it a day, and they trudged back to the locked doors of their houses, and I climbed the stairs to the locked door of my garret, where I write you this poem instead of my usual email, not about the extra money I am due, but about the grains of sand which seem to sift through my fingers today, each grain chafing at another life each child imagines happening, about the heaviness weighing on them, drooping their shoulders like sandbags the residents of some river town carry to make the embankments they need to hold back the imminent flood. Nonetheless, people, please remember to credit me the higher rate of pay I am in fact due, if only for offering my empty hand, then for filling it with pencils I personally sharpened, cursing the pencil maker for their off-center leads, as I then gave each student their own wand to calculate the magic of wisdom and to mark down the answers they are trying to find, the true values of the algebraic x's in the countless disappointments that make up the lopsided equations of their lives. Tomorrow, I'll sub again, and I promise to send you another reminder. Until then, keep the home fires burning and the old time clock well oiled. We'll never know, will we, when the electric world will fail and the spark of connection dies. The next poem I'd like to read is a poem that I've used when doing groups on the detox unit as sort of just merely as as a springboard to try to get the patients into talking. And it's entitled The Black Wolf of Your Past. Suppose you do change your life, and the black wolf, which was once your shadow, silently howls against this extinction. What do you then do for this feral darkness out of which you grew, which has trailed you all your life with a loyalty reserved for pets? You see it cower, shrink back deep into the doghouse of your thoughts, the long leash of its reach diminished. What do you do for this wolf you have fed since birth? Throw it a bone? The sort of flip side of the addiction coin are the people that live with addicts and alcoholics. And this one is entitled The Elephant in the Room. Thick-skinned, wrinkled, and gray, it sits surrounded by eggshells you must walk on, but not disturb. Dais of denial and false complacency, ancient demon of faltering families, just when you think it's disappeared like an obsolete religion, fear of God, out of the corner of your eye, you see its long reach snake up to sniff you out. You see it sit again in the easy chair by the standing lamp, cross its legs, all big-eared and selectively deaf, then snap open the paper like a whip, make you jump, crush the shells. My next poem, I'd like to just read my note before I read the poem, the note on this poem. The poem is entitled The March Hare, and I got this description of a March hare from Wikipedia. To be as mad as a March hare is an English idiomatic phrase derived from the observed antics said to occur in the March breeding season of the European hare, Lepus europus. The phrase is an allusion that can be used to refer to any other animal or human who behaves in the excitable and unpredictable manner of a March hare. A long-held view is that the hare will behave strangely and excitedly throughout its breeding season, which in Europe peaks in the month of March. This odd behavior includes boxing at other hares, jumping vertically for seemingly no reason, and generally displaying abnormal behavior. The March hare. Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match. It was almost the end of the shift. Someone on the muzak above was playing a bebop version of Matchmaker when one of the patients sauntered over. Slouching in front of me, he hooked his thumbs into his belt loops, spread his legs apart, and rocked back and forth, copying a kind of wise guy, cowboy attitude. He said he wanted to leave, and he understood the best way to get out of Dodge was to get married, and then he could leave tonight. I could call him a cab, but first I had to find him a woman to marry. He must have been sizing me up all night. I'd been hanging out in a nice comfy armchair with a modern cartoonish pattern of outsized flowers in a soothing, non-violent color scheme that went well with the rest of the unit's subtle decor. The tune piping down from the ceiling changed to something I didn't recognize. But I was still feeling pretty good. No woman in my life, music in my ears, and until then, a quiet night in the tilting house of the hare. By now, he was looming over me, intently waiting for my answer. All 6'6" of him, and by his girth, a good 450 pounds, maybe more. Well, I said as I stood up to my full 5'9.5" let me look into this. I've got to inquire to see who's available. It might take a moment or two, but I'll get right back. And I sauntered out of reach, whistling whatever tune was playing. Maybe Hit the Road Jack with a fast alto sax squealing out like a tire, or 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, something memorable for one man's desire, but not another's. So I've got two more poems that I would read, and the first of these is about well, one of the units that I work on is an adolescent unit, and it's an inpatient unit, an inpatient adolescent unit. So that's different from the kids that go to school, who live in a group house, and they're much more acute, obviously, than the kids that live in a group house. And the two things that you have to sort of be aware of when you're working on that unit, because the kids are so sort of, in an acute mental state, is that they not find something sharp to self-harm with. And what they'll often do is find something and cut themselves on their arms or maybe somewhere else, but usually on their arms. And that induces endorphins, which alleviates the kind of psychological pain that they have. And the other thing, which is a little bit more serious, is that they not try to rip apart their clothing and try to hang themselves, which had happened before. And so those are two things that are sort of referenced in the poem, okay? And this poem is entitled Fairy Tale for a Young Inpatient. Down, down, way down at the very bottom of the old wishing well. The one with the broken crank, no rope and no pail. The one still covered by the quaint, scant roof, meant to keep other things out. Down, down to where the memories you keep lie at the bottom like tarnished pennies. One day there will appear a splendid fish, as red and as gold as your fabulous cape, my princess, my forlorn one. You will see it swim in the deep, distorting murk we all wish to forget, fluttering its fins like a fledgling, testing its way out of the well. And you will drop a line, a strangling thread from your cape, unspun in desperation, trying once more to reach beyond the bottom to where there are no memories. But you will catch this fish instead, reeling it in like a new story worth telling, unnoticed until now, though it has always been there, flickering about between the dull coins. And after you pull up this fish with its sparkling gossamer fins, You will wrap it gently in the matching colors of your cape. Cradle it in your scarred arms all the way up the narrow, insufficient path of your past, with its many twists and turns, along the whole cruelty of that journey. Then finally bring it down the other side to a calm place where the lake water licks the shore in little waves. There you will kneel down and surrender all that you've carried into that clear water, stretching yourself out to swim with the fish, the beautiful one you rescued. And then my last poem is entitled Puppet Therapy. And there used to be a woman that worked on weekends, and she would go through a number of the different units and do groups, and they would change from week to week. But one of the groups she did was a puppet therapy group, and she laid out a whole series of objects on a table, and people were allowed to pick up whatever they wanted, and it was to be an object which somehow had some relationship to them, and to their plight, what was happening emotionally in their lives, and they would speak about it and share their thoughts, and then somebody else would continue. So this is a derivative from watching these groups. Puppet therapy. I watch a man, hands toying his totem. He talks to the group, his fingers playing out his words on the table. Everyone leans in a little closer as he fiddles with a small green turtle made of rubber. He explains the sinking turtle of his self, how he wants to shed the dark carapace he carries. When the day begins to sag and the heaviness you're born to, when the day begins to lag and the heaviness you're born to sags through your veins because the clouds have muddled the blue right out of your sky, you just drop your soul into the deep mud of your being. You just stop right there in the middle of the road, become a hard lump against the black tar of the difficult day. He shoves the turtle head inside its shell. This is where he lives most of his days. Now he takes a small enameled butterfly from the table of assorted objects. It is made of tin. He loves its delicate mobility, the way it inhabits the air, unmuddied, not dirigible, the way it doesn't hold the air inside like a breath you can never expel. Instead, its wings, replete with color, twitch, then flutter, and the whole world leaps happily after. Somewhere, he knows it is there. He feels a bright fluttering in the rib cage of his gloom that is more than just the sluggish heart pumping to survive. He says, this time he will crack the shell. This time he will see the quivering inside emerge, cleave from the hard cocoon of his heaviness, and he will see its splendid wings spread, and a gaudy glory will hover all red and yellow over the green and brown smudge of his life. There we go. Thank you very much. Sid?
My turn?
Yeah.
Oh, Tim, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to appear with you and to hear those wrenching poems is to realize that I have no right ever in my life to self-pity. In fact, during this whole quarantine thing, I've been living something of an idyllic life. We live in the country half a mile from the nearest neighbor. And fortunately, we have the opposite of a contentious marriage. The only real agony is not being able to see our grandchildren, all of whom are in Vermont. I want to echo first your thanks to Michelle for setting this up under difficult conditions, and to thank her especially for putting us two together. That's a great pleasure for me. This quarantine period, which actually for us is extended quite a bit longer because we were actually in the Caribbean for the first ever tropical vacation of our lives. And on the way back, we got stuck in Newark Airport for about 6 hours, and people were hacking and coughing all around us. This was early-ish in March when people were just starting to talk about this. We had, however, stayed at an Italian-owned resort. They assured me that they hadn't been home for several years, but nonetheless, we thought it would be wise to be prudent. And one of the things that I took it upon myself to do was to write a kind of Corona sequence of poems. And the object, that, although we spent a fair amount of time outdoors, being cooped up, I just began to write about things around the house, everyday objects. I call the sequence animate objects, in fact. It goes to 17 pages. I'm not going to read all of them by any matter of means. I was stunned by the fact that the American Journal of Poetry took the whole 17-page sequence. I still can't quite believe that. It'll be out in July. And I want to read about equally from it, and then I will read from my latest book. It doesn't matter in what sequence, you won't see the whole sequence, obviously, but I'm going to begin with one that's called Old Walking Shoes. They seemed marvels, I recall, to all 5 kids, and still they're here, as who'd have predicted. Those toy plastic sneakers, bright blue with a key on the side to wind them. I remember the children's eyes going wide on watching them start to take their brisk steps, in some cases before those children themselves could walk. I noticed the shoes as I headed out the door for my own walk on what we call the loop. Old game beats sustained by a long time back and forth. We know each inch. Half a mile or so from the house, there's the dull brass plaque benchmarked by USGS on a headstone. Or so the pale rock once appeared to me. Now, though I'm slower as 80 impends, I've pledged to fend off such simile. Next, I'll find branches shorn and drops from oak to trail when last winter loomed by porcupines in their ardor for nuts. Next comes the vernal pool where soon the boisterous gray frogs will start up their yatter. And my wife will have to talk more than loud if she wants her half-deaf husband to hear what she says. Spring sounds will return. I'm out of these clouds and the sudden thrumming of snow mixed with rain. Near the end stands the hill where once, at 5, our youngest was riding high on my back when I slid and fell. That same good wife returned right after with clippers to crop the thorn whip that came too close to taking the small girl's eye. But I'd started these thoughts before tyrant memory's usual break-in with some little blue wind-up walking shoes. Now they fascinate small children once more, eyes keen to watch them trudge the floor, though all the old feet can manage to do after so many years is a stiff step or two. The second poem is a poem that I wrote for a friend of mine from Sarajevo, I think one of the world's great poets. His name is Goran Simic, spells it the same as our Charles Simic. He's a fellow Serb who lived in Sarajevo during the Troubles, so he was an object of hatred from one side of one of the many sides of that conflict. Given that he was married to a Muslim woman, he was an object of dislike from other quarters as well. He really had nowhere to turn, but he's a marvelous, marvelous poet, and you can see his poems in the Oxford poetry series. And this is a poem called Balloon and Flowers. I dropped into sleep while reading a book of poems by the Bosnian friend I write for here. They're brilliant, full of red flowers and graves and wrenching accounts of his homeland during the 90s. They lend some perspective on our COVID-19 scourge, which I don't mean to downplay, much less to discount the unforgivable part in worsening it of our leader, jackass and villain. Goran's a Serb and his wife was a Muslim woman. During the Troubles, he really had nowhere to turn. His poetry makes my guts knot. It's not a sort you'd think of as soporific, but being so anxious for 3 generations of family has made me restless, almost each night, until of course I was tired. I'd been sitting in my wife's dear grandfather's rocker, handsome but sternly wooden. Still I nodded off. And when I came to, I noticed I had drooled on my shirt front, like any old fool might do. And yet, the sun of afternoon through the kitchen window turned even the spot of spittle to something lovely. Unlikely enough, and the next thing to snare my attention were a once vivid mum in a glass and a reddish balloon, left over from my wondrous partner's 64th birthday, back before we knew what the world was in for, though that contemptible leader had been forewarned. Our grandchildren's eyes turned bright as my wife blew out candles. The smaller kids batting balloons like that one up into air. All that before some weeks unraveled and people got sick, many died, and that balloon, that flower, sole survivors, puckered and shrank to half their old sizes and somehow looked so sad that I went back. It makes no sense, I know, to those agonizing poems of plunder and murder. My mother's family are all Pennsylvania Mennonites. And one of the few things I have left from several generations ago is a beautiful grandfather clock, appropriately enough. This poem is simply called Clock. My great-grandfather's upright clock was wrought in a village in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania by a local craftsman, who may have been the old man's neighbor. But I shouldn't say old. My ancestors are not yet that at all. Having shaped the body out of fine black walnut, the maker, or someone, rendered the beaming face of the moon behind the hands. Is it wrong of me not to have had its inner workings restored to function? It's almost as though I celebrate their silence. There's a plaque on the cabinet door, made in Emmaus, 1874, but the artisan's name has sunk into the brass and vanished, the world being rife with metaphor and memento mori. Or so I can muse in 2 dark moods, being old now myself. That fact in itself seems scarcely linked to what I think, except that I think it. When Fats Domino died some years ago, my dear friend Stephen telephoned. We've always craved the music that crossed into the mainstream in Fats's day. My friend's very ill. We reminisced, each grateful the man arrived just in time to rescue us when we were kids from the Boones and Nelsons. I still hear my first 45. We happy in my blue heaven. I also hear my poor hungover mother's protest. My God, what is that? Well, what it wasn't, to her dismay, was the old-time Tin Pan Alley version, all roses and strings. May the woman's agonized soul be at rest. Just now, I drink the splendor of sunshine through my window. Days like this, so chiseled and bright, bring fall to mind. They're downright exquisite, and yet, of course, it's spring I should think of now. Autumn means silence, not song. My friend has cancer. The hills are still fall bare, but lovely and sharp as fine carved wood, and the moon sheds gorgeous light. Why November then, that cliched omen of winter, our 11th hour, which I haven't yet let my old clock strike. And then the final poem in the series was prompted I suppose, tellingly, by something outside the house, not inside, and it was the arrival of the season's first goldfinch at our feeder. This is called Talisman, and it bears as an epigraph the famous remark by Walt Whitman, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself." Talisman. Far south of here, the hired man called them beet birds, his notion being that they came as the beet's first green did. It would be facile, I think, this morning, sleet gripping the broad leaves' earliest buds, to make our first goldfinch a trope for hope. A dull winter it's been for birds, right enough. Nothing flashy on a given day. Only the same chickadees and pine siskins. Not even many jays, as a rule unwelcome, for spots of color. Perhaps dullness should be the trope, in fact, because it's not just COVID-19 that threatens the world. I've embraced some gratitude, rubbish and heat overtaking us all, that I entered the world when I did. Today's intellectual life and its social being ones I'm glad, on a visit, say, some techno session, not to have lived with for long. Can a friend really be a set of electrons? Can public discourse survive on contumely and witlessness? The goldfinch, a female, is described as having precisely dull yellow underparts. In our sequestration, we trust that this one is merely a start, that in time we will not want for bright males and subtle females both. And they will arrive, unless they don't. My favorites, cedar waxwings, say, once clouded our pond summer long, then plucked the flowering crabapple tree right through till snow. Now I'm all but amazed to see a group of three. Well, why not admit it? I'm at that age when men and women have forever sneered at the ever-worsening state of their world and of its heirs of plain decadence. I've tried to spit in the eye of this pandemic. Come dawn, I've made myself opt for blitheness. No matter I'm aware just how much of this has been mere acts. So be it. There sits the bird. Look, why shouldn't we cleave to such cheering signs as we can? Why not keep our poses alive? Agreed. I reverse myself. For example, I'll proclaim that the beet birds will swarm in a bright assortment so ample as to constitute what once was labeled not a flock, but a charm. This is my newest book entitled Here, released untimely, about coincidentally with the arrival of the coronavirus, but available if you happen to be in Montpelier at the wonderful Bear Pond bookstore, to whom many, many cheers. And you have to get it perhaps through the mail, but it's available or out through the back door. I'm not sure how they're handling it, or over closer to me, though about 45 minutes south of me, the Norwich bookstore has been great in that sense too. And also Four-Way Books, my publisher, will, if you Google them, they will arrange to have it sent to you as well. I'll read 4 poems from it. The first one has to do with the fact that I was very nearly born in the state of Alabama. I was not, for reasons that the poem will reveal. It's called The Owl and I. Once the Jim Crack cross got burned on our lawn, my mother took off back north to have me. My father was stationed in Gadsden, Alabama, before the Second Great War, commander of so-called colored troops. And he'd invited a few of his men into the house, it seems. A radical thing indeed just then in the heart of Jim Crow Dixie. So my mother escaped giving birth down there, though I don't have any idea why I'd think of this, which near to her death she spoke of so many years after. Why now? I'm watching a barred owl glide to a hemlock gone dark at sundown. Everything else is well going dark around me here where I stand. Once at midnight, She thought she'd heard a whoop of human anguish and wondered whether some soldier were being lynched outside. My father went for a look, but found nothing. My lifelong relations with my mother were vexed, I now suspect, in part because between us two stood a lot in common. Jews were being crammed into cattle cars then, but for Dad and those troops, the evil in Europe lay several months ahead. Still, real or imagined, that cry of mortal misery stuck with Mother. Though no signs of nearby violence turned up next morning, the company came en masse to mess, shit on a shingle, as the GIs said, dried beef on toast. So life went on, at least for a while, more or less. It ought to bring comfort that I'm here where I am, aging but safe, my kin constantly swelling as sons and daughters produce their sons and daughters. And winter so harsh this year, giving way at last to spring with snowdrops glinting, the freshets making their evanescent cascades through the woods. I recall how my mother loved this season. Why then this lonely sensation? It feels that I'm in some pitch black tunnel and won't get out again. That this, as the saying goes, is it. That all I'll have at the end, of course there can't be anything to it, is the sorrowful 8-note anthem of that single owl, the sound now, just now, having reached my vexed old head, though I'd be foolish to think that song was addressed to anyone human. Many, many years ago, in a part of Maine that's been very important to my family via my father's side, I was in a canoe. It was the summer of 1964, the summer I graduated from college, and I was just idly fishing. I wasn't very serious about catching anything or not, just sort of enjoying not being in school anymore, pro tem. And I looked up from my line and I noticed that the whole opposite shore was on fire. We don't have those kinds of fires much in the East anymore because we have better firefighting equipment and better surveillance and so on. But this one, it burned all summer long, essentially. They got it under control after 4 or 5 days, but then those fires will go into the duff of the forest floor and come up somewhere else. So they always had to have a lookout and had to put out little fires until the snow came. It's called Fire and Jewel. 80-foot hemlock, spruce, fir, pine. They kept lifting off their stumps like so many rockets, smoke trails and all. And I beheld the fire cross lake from where I drifted. I'd been plumbing the water for fish when my eyes were lifted. 50 years later, I still recall my thoughts and how I felt that to think them was more than odd. I was glad I had faculties to behold the hill's astonishing orange heat as it flared to white with each explosion. Then the whole of the configuration bending toward earth, a horizontal wall, a monolith that somehow tore downhill in a sudden fury of wind. It was gorgeous. Several hours would go by till I learned Earl Bailey was forced to fly as quickly as he could on his dozer down from the ridge right into Farm Cove. He just had to take the loss. It was that or burn. Donald Chambers, wielding an axe in his turn with a makeshift crew, collapsed from labor and heat. And Paul, the storekeeper, dragged him away by his feet. I knew Don, sadly, just a few more years. He and Earl and Paul, good, honest men. I can't account for dreams, like the one last night when I watched that fire again. And what seemed again pure quiet, serene, the same jetliner as years ago crossed high, the same scent rose, torch needles, caustic smoke. The same evil roar came on as I rocked in the same canoe, the waves still slapping its hull. In an hour, 5 decades back, the length of that ridgeline turned the color of onyx. The latest of my wife's birthdays will soon be upon us. Is that why the dream passed smoothly into the next one? I saw precisely a beautiful onyx stone hung on her breast from a slip of chain. I'd never dreamt such a woman as that hillside blackened. Wouldn't meet her for years. Today, I drove to a jewelry shop as if still dreaming. 300 miles to the west of that little mountain. I bought the necklace and felt some fire in my being. Mild version of one that kindled in that old autumn, which has, for a long time, underground, kept burning. Two more. I have a picture a friend took of our house above her. We've got one of the great attractions of the property is that it has a nice 7-acre enhanced natural pond. And the picture of the house, it's reflected in the pond absolutely perfectly on a very still summer day. This is a poem called The View in Late Winter. My wife and one of her daughters home to visit sleep through the creaks and moans of timber and sill. More than I might have once, I welcome warmth, so I drop in a log. One fights the tug of nostalgia, fights to accept the idea of acceptance, of surrendering first one thing, then others, then all. To judge by the journal I just took down from a shelf, on this very day in 1968, I hiked all the way up Mousley Mountain to camp at Height of Land. There are maybe a dozen visions etched forever into my mind, and one, however minor, is of that night when the world seemed oddly, generously upside down. From high above them, I spied on a pair of night birds that coasted tree to tree below, while their perfect shadows below them slid over snow cast there by a moon as wrought as museum marble. All else but those birds and shadows supremely still. I just inspected the mercury through a frosted pane. At 22 below, it seems far too frigid to scrape the ashes out of the firebox. I should have done so before this cold snap, but that would have meant letting the stove go dead to haul them, and thus to invite the chill into our kitchen. Instead of moon or predator or hill, from a favorite chair beside the stove, I fix on a lovely ceramic plate we found in an Umbrian village somewhere, our honeymoon, years ago. On the cluttered counter before it stands, still photographs of children and their children. I see pictures as well of dogs, most of them gone. Each thing in anyone's life is fated to go, though here it comes, the faithful day. I long, however vainly, for what I've loved to stay. Another photo shows our house by the pond, with its still, inverted reflection in water below. And finally, I'm a little rueful that poor Tim, who generously came to a reading far north of where he lives, will have heard all these before, but they're ones that I'm fond of reading, so he's just going to have to put up with it, I guess. This one is called My Wife's Back. I live virtually on the Connecticut River, and often my wife and I will go down there in a canoe and poke around and see what we can see. The river up where we live is pretty much lake-like, so coming upstream is just as easy as going down. This is called My Wife's Back. All naked but for a strap, it traps my gaze as we paddle, the dear familiar nubs of spine bone punctuating that sun-warmed swath. The slender muscles that trouble the same sweet surface. We've watched and smiled as green herons flushed and hopped ahead at every bend, and we've looked up at a red tail tracing open script on a sky so clear and deep we might believe it's autumn, no matter it's August still. Another fall will be on us before we know it. Of course, we adore that commotion of color, but it seems to come again as soon as it's gone away. They all do now. My love for you over 40 years extends in all directions, but now to your back as we drift and paddle down the tranquil Connecticut River. We've seen a mink scratch fleas on a mudflat. We've seen an osprey start to dive, but seeing us think better of it. 2 phoebes wagged on an ash limb. Your torso is long. I can't see your legs, but they're longer, I know. Phoebe, osprey, heron, hawk. Marbles under Black Mountain. But I'm fixed on your back, indifferent to other wonders. Bright minnows that flared in the shallows, the gleam off that poor mink's coat, even the fleas in its fur, the various birds, the lust of creatures, just to survive. But I watch your back. Never have I wished more not to die. Thank you, whoever you may be.
Wow.
Tim, I was greatly taken by your poems. I mean, there's I have a poem to my friend Goran Simic, another one in which I say, you know, I'm perfectly happy to be a poet of no consequence and not to have that kind of subject matter. They really are. I salute you for your work. I don't mind. Most people who know me well know that I've been in recovery a long, long time. Blessed by it. Unlike my poor mother, with whom my relations were vexed largely because she didn't have I choose to believe in grace, whatever your religious orientation may be, and I was lucky enough to get it, and she did not. And I thought that your evocation of what it's like to live with the likes of me back in my ripping and roaring days was particularly acute and observant. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Well, thank you. It's I think I somehow knew you were in recovery, and of course I'm in recovery too, and have been for a long time. And one of the things that I found, though, when I spent time working on the detox unit, that it's not as easy as one hopes for. So much more for some of the people that come back and back and back, and they're struggling. You know, they are coming back. And you can get to a point where you're discouraged when you know, mainly because you don't see the successes, you don't see the people that don't come back, and they don't come back because they succeeded in finding a path to recovery. Yeah, I had one of the poems in the book deals with running across someone like that. I kind of, I think one of the things that can happen in working in a mental institution is that you can end up suffering from what people call compassion fatigue. You know, is that you run out of the compassion that you may have. It's just not an endless well. But so that it's good to sometimes take time off so that you can come back to it and feel the kind of, you know, the kind of thing that you need to feel to help people.
Absolutely. I have a wonderful young woman in her late 20s who used that phrase for me, compassion fatigue, because she had worked, was very active in her position at the Upper Valley Haven, which is a homeless shelter, of a wonderful one, I might add. But she said she felt that she had to get away too for fear of suddenly becoming indifferent to things that she knew perfectly well when she got indifferent. What else should we talk about? We promised that we would have a bit of a dialogue. Are you working on something beyond that book now?
I'm starting to. I did do a number of things that, I ended up having to take some time off from work, and as a result, I had just lots of time and realized, wow, I can try to to rearrange my life and try to write on a more regular basis, which worked for a couple of weeks, and I got a few poems out, and which were good and different from the ones that I've been writing for this book. But you know, I've run out of steam for the moment, and I'm hoping that I'll get another second wind in you know, maybe later this week or so.
I suspect you will, and I too hope that you will. I don't know about you. I have found that here is my 13th collection, and after I've published the book, I tend to go into a long hiatus, and I used to panic me early on, and now I recognize that it's some peculiar pathology. But I used to say, well, that's the last book I'll ever write. That's the last book I should ever write, and so I'll do something else. And I've when that happened the first time in a really acute way, I decided that I would try and write a novel of all mad things to do, and I did. And I published it. And I've been trying since 1996 to write another one, but it doesn't want to get written. I keep these poems keep interfering. But I wonder, have you had that experience after getting a book out into public, feeling, well, you know, sort of that's, I will wait a while before I try anything else?
I have to some extent, and well, one thing that has happened to me is I've thought, well, I have to promote my book, and so therefore I arrange to have all sorts of readings and things like that, and that just ends up taking so much energy that you just don't think about writing. You know, you're maybe practicing reading, or you know, or trying to, you know, get down the next you know, the next time when you can read at X, Y, and Z bookstore or whatever. And that during that time, I'm definitely not writing. But this time of being sheltering in place, I think has worked well for me at this point.
Me too. If there's a bright side for us, selfishly speaking. I want to ask you a question that I'm sure you've been asked many times before. I know it's a really dumb question, but that's sort of the point, because you can do with it whatever you want to do. I'm reminded my late friend Bill Matthews was once asked after a reading, he said, "Oh, I really like those. Are those real poems or did you make them up?" Very, very hard to understand the question, let alone answer it. But you know, people come up and say, well, where do you get your inspiration, or where do you get your ideas? And I'm sure you've had that question asked, and you know, often by people who want to steal them so they can get going themselves. And I don't say that in any condescending way. I understand it, but I'm wondering how you respond to it when you get it.
I for the most part, I mean, it's not, I mean, I think of, you know, the adage that poetry deals with truth, and for a long time, I thought that it meant journalistic truth, and that, you know, you couldn't say something that never had really happened, that you had to approach it like a journalist. And all of a sudden I realized that there isn't any reason for that necessarily. And I think one of the times that I began to realize that was I did an MFA about, well, now about 16 years ago or so. And one of my teachers in the MFA program claimed that he wrote a lot of narrative poems, and a lot of them had to do with seeming events in his life. And he said that they were all fictitious. They were all fiction. Mine, I don't think usually come out of that. In most cases, there's at least some truth to the beginning of the story, if not to the end. But there have been a couple. There's one poem in this book in particular that that I made this fellow up entirely from scratch. Or maybe he's a composite of a couple of people that I knew. You think about, one of the things that scared me about this book is HIPAA, which is the hospital patient privacy law, federal law, that you have to be very careful that you're not revealing, who you're talking about and the like. And so I've been very fearful of that, and that kept me for a long time from either publishing any of these or putting this together. And it seems to me, though, that I don't know whether I'd like to, maybe create something create a cloth out of something that doesn't necessarily, it's more from my imagination than from my experience, but I haven't been able to do that. I've not tried writing much fiction, so I don't know. In your case, did the fiction that you wrote and have tried to write again, is that based on things in your life or not?
Absolutely. And I say this not in the least moralistically. I just talk about things that enable me. And I find it very, very difficult. In fact, I don't even try very hard to write about things outside my own experience. Even when I used to write more specifically narrative poems, I had the same concern you did. I didn't want to, it's not my business to hang out somebody else's dirty laundry in public. But I also found that the characters I used as in fiction were composites, as you say. It's a little bit strange because all my life I've had hearing problems. I now have hearing aids. They're not conspicuous because they're the new hip kind. But strangely enough, my memory is very acute for things I hear, much more than for things I see or read. And so poems for me often originate in a snatch of conversation of some kind or another, something I've heard, or interestingly enough, given my deafness, often misheard. I thought I heard somebody say one day for some reason, and why would I have thought this? But I love the rhythm of the phrase. It says, horrified as diamonds, people die in abattoirs. Well, I never used that, but it tripped a poem called Abattoir. That line appeared in it originally until I discovered that it was absolutely irrelevant to what I was trying to get done. But that's how things tend to get going for me. I think that you're aware of this, I'm sure yourself, although you haven't been a teacher professionally primarily, is that people, including a lot of academics, by the way, think that poetry is kind of a criticism in reverse. You start with an idea and then you cover it all up with, things like metric language or rhyme or whatever you may choose, so that the critic can come along, get rid of all that stuff and get back to the idea. And I have to make clear to them that if you know where you're going before you start, you're done for. You're not going to have any, there's not going to be any juice in your poem. You're not going to make any discoveries. I always hope I can make some kind of a discovery, to discover something that I didn't know I knew, or to use, or maybe just discover a turn of phrase that I had never used before in my life. I suppose I don't know if the story is apocryphal or not, but it said that a young man came up to W.H. Auden and said, Mr. Auden, I have a wonderful idea for a poem. And his response was, I'm so dreadfully sorry to hear that. Anyway, well, it's been great to be with you, and stay well.
Same to you.
One of my two sons has a brother-in-law who's, after count them 3 trips to Iraq and 2 to Afghanistan as a special forces medic, is now coordinating the coronavirus response down your way. So I'm kind of praying for him as well. All of us have friends and relatives and heroes who are out there braving the elements. May it soon go its unlamented course away. And meanwhile, stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
And you stay safe too. And